welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service El Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasoliti, president of El Monitor, and our guests today are RAND researchers Dalia Dassa Kaye, Linda Robinson, and Jeffrey Martini. And they will talk to us about their latest study, and one that's already getting a lot of attention, called Reimaging US Strategy in the Middle East, Sustainable Partnerships, Strategic Investments. It's going to be a very full program with three fantastic guests. And let me begin by saying they're good friends and colleagues who I have learned an awful lot from over the years. Many of you may know I returned to El Monitor just over 2 years ago after serving as director of the RAND Center for Global Risk and Security, as well as international marketing manager for RAND's National Security Research Division. And I continue my affiliation with RAND as an adjunct political scientist. Dalia Dassa Kaye, who is the lead author of this report, is a senior political scientist at RAND, a Wilson Center Fellow, and a former director of the RAND Center for Middle East Public Policy. Linda Robinson is the current director of the Center for Middle East Public Policy and a senior international defense researcher at RAND and a best-selling author. And Jeffrey Martini is senior Middle East researcher at RAND, where he works on political and security issues in the Arab world. He also served for a time at the State Department looking at North Africa issues. My conversation with Dalia Dassa Kaye, Linda Robinson, and Jeffrey Martini about reimagining U.S. strategy in the Middle East begins now. Dalia, Linda, Jeff, welcome to On the Middle East.
Thanks, Andrew.
Great to be with you, Andrew.
Let's get right into it. You all have released an incredibly timely RAND report on U.S. policy in the Middle East. And one of the many things I like about the report is that you put everything on the table regarding U.S. policy. You challenge long-held assumptions and suggest new metrics to evaluate aid and partnerships. And what jumps out at me is that how you approach this topic in this region could really be a template to be applied to U.S. foreign policy in other regions more broadly. Dalia, could you tell us a little about the origins of the report and how you all came to what you came to in putting this together?
Yeah, well, thanks again so much, Andrew, for spending the time to read it. And you're right, it is a comprehensive report, and we do hope it's applied not just to the Middle East, but kind of shakes up thinking more globally. But what really led us to engage in this is, recognizing this frustration with longstanding policies, decade after decade, across administrations that just don't seem to be producing great results for the region, for U.S. interest. And there's also recognition that we have other priorities today. We have, growing attention on the great power competition with Russia and China in particular. We have all these domestic pressures here at home, economic pressures, of course, the pandemic. So we really thought this is a good moment to step back, think strategically about what might be a smarter way to deal with this region where we don't keep producing the same poor results again and again without really rethinking, as you said, our basic assumptions of what's driving us in this region, and in particular, rethinking what we call legacy thinking and investments that we frankly believe were designed for a different era.
Jeff, let me ask about the approach to partnerships in the study. Help us understand the metrics you employ and how your approach in the report would lead to changes in U.S. policy and practice regarding our longstanding partnerships in the Middle East.
Sure, Andrew, thanks for that. So sort of beginning with our critique and picking up where Dalia left off, we really see legacy considerations driving U.S. relationships with partners. And so to give you a couple of examples, if you look at the way that the U.S. manages its partnerships with Egypt, with Jordan, with Israel, what we call the big three in this report, because they're the big three recipients of US foreign military financing, what we see is the United States is underwriting a peace which is self-perpetuating. Fortunately, we're not in an era in which there's a risk of interstate wars between Israel and the Arab states, and yet we continue to interact as if these states are on the brink of war. So that's an example of kind of legacy considerations driving US partnerships. Or if we look at the Arab Gulf states, the traditional metric or the traditional logic has been, the US maintaining energy security in return for providing security guarantees to these states. And yet, as we all know, the United States is a major energy exporter today. And while there's some residual dependence on foreign oil, a lot of that is not from the Middle East. Or if we look at the major security threats in the region, traditionally the United States was lined up to confront, during the Cold War, Soviet influence, or later an expansionist Saddam Hussein's Iraq, or now this multidimensional threat posed by Iran. And yet, if we think about where is there a security deficit in the region, what we actually see is domestic instability in the form of uprisings and disconnects in local labor markets and a lack of opportunity. That's what's driving instability, not this sort of narrow look at hard security. So what we are calling for is a major rethink of these partnerships, and beginning with the core US interest in mind for this area, which is regional stability. So instead of thinking about lining up one block of states to counter another, or thinking about countering one of these threats, what we're thinking about is trying to build greater regional stability to lower the costs of US engagement in the region and thereby have a better return on investment.
Jeff, let me follow up a little on that. So let's talk just for a second about, say, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, two key pillars of U.S. partnership and security relationships in the region. There have been some issues in the news with Saudi Arabia and human rights, especially with the release of the ODNI report last week and the subsequent sanctions. But don't we need Saudi Arabia, say, to end the war in Yemen, which is the UN has called the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in the world, to deter Iran, even assuming a best case outcome? We'll get into that in a few minutes regarding Iran policy, but we still need partnerships, strong security partnerships for our deterrent posture, and to play a key role in an Israeli-Palestinian peace if there were to be another spur of diplomacy. And then I might put Egypt in that mix too. They'll also be a key player in Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy. They're a key player in Libya, where we have some promising news, hopefully, resolving the war there. So how do you see the ability to engage these longstanding partners, some of whom would, I think, drop a bit according to your metrics, but we still need them to do big things in the region?
A point well taken, Andrew, and totally concur. What we're advocating for in this report is not an abandonment of traditional U.S. partners. And so while we think there needs to be a major recalibration, there's room for the type of cooperation you've talked about. So on Saudi Arabia, we think the Biden administration has, in the main, gotten it right, that rolling back the foreign terrorist organization designation of the Houthis, releasing the ODNI report, stopping basically the United States enabling Saudi offensive strikes in Yemen by holding up foreign military sales that provide the munitions for those strikes, and also urging GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council reconciliation. Those are the right steps. But it was also a nuanced approach in terms of reaffirming U.S. support for the defense of Saudi Arabia by continuing to assist, for example, in the sharing of intelligence to counter cross-border threats from the Houthis that have taken the form of missiles and drones and these basically these boats that are used to ram other ships. And so that's the type of nuanced approach that we're calling for in this report. I will say there's an open question on the degree to which the administration is going to apply that logic more broadly to other states like Egypt. I think I was reading your Friday roll-up in El Monitor, and the question was posed, is this going to be broader than Saudi Arabia? And to me, that's an open question, and Egypt is the obvious place where you would land this policy next. It's a country that frankly has declined in strategic importance for the United States. It's a country that's engaged in a lot of unhelpful behavior, even though, as you noted recently, it's been a little more helpful in Libya. And it's a country with serious human rights baggage that is not that different from Saudi Arabia. So the question, I think, for the administration is this sort of recalibration with Riyadh going to be applied more broadly?
Jeff, one more quick question on partnerships is, tell us about those countries who we should be engaging more with, because I was also taken by that in the study, that there are some other countries where you think the United States has a role and more effective engagement in the approach that you're advocating. Some other countries might rise in terms of their ability to work with the United States on our interests and our values.
Yeah, we do argue, myself, Dalia, Linda, and the other co-authors, that we really need to ramp up engagement with partners that meet positive criteria. And those positive criteria are countries that de-escalate regional conflict. Within the Arab Gulf states, Kuwait and Oman are probably the best examples, and countries that pursue inclusive politics. Traditionally, post-Arab Spring, Tunisia was thought of in that category, although they're facing a lot of domestic tumult right now again. But in general, what we advocate for is for those states that pursue inclusive politics, inclusive governance, that work to de-escalate regional conflict, that are sort of unheralded counterterrorism partners, of which the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF, are, that there needs to be a greater uptick in US engagement with those states, rather than this very narrow focus on a small set of traditional partners with a lot of the programming sort of pre-programmed, if you will. Yeah.
Let's turn to Iran. Dalia, you've written a lot about Iran over the years. You've done a lot of work in this area. There's a section of this report that talks about right-sizing Iran as an adversary and as a focus in U.S. policy. Tell us what you mean by that, and tell us what you think the Biden administration should and could be doing to advance policy toward Iran in a right-sized way, as you describe in your report.
Yeah, well, I think what we mean by that is that, and while this report is largely arguing for not just keeping with what we call threatism paradigm, where we're always focused on what we're against, but we also need to balance that with, this more positive agenda of partners and policies that we can be supporting that focus on the socioeconomic and governance challenges that really are the threats of the day. But we're not naive about things. We understand that there are threats like Iran and challenges like Iran we need to deal with. So when we talk about right sizing, it's really about putting the Iranian threat in perspective. And there, what we're talking about is, yes, it's a very serious regional concern and challenge to U.S. interests, to all of our regional partners, particularly its asymmetric capabilities in its missile development becoming much more accurate and lethal. Its support for non-state militia forces. We just saw the consequences of that last week in Iraq. So we understand the challenges, but we do argue that there is pushback against Iran in this region. Iran faces limits. First of all, it's conventionally incredibly weak, especially when you compare it to some of the best military forces in the world. When you look at Israel, which is regularly containing Iran in Syria with military strikes on a frequent basis. Of course, the U.S. military is the Iranian are no match for the US military on any level. And then we have natural pushback from the neighborhood. A lot of frustration with Iranian interventions. The Syrian conflict in particular has really undermined Iran's soft power influence. A lot of nationalist sentiment in countries like Iraq, and of course, even in Lebanon, which is these are the countries more traditionally in the Iranian camp, not to mention the Arab Gulf, interested in pushing back against the Iranian influence, though there's variation there. So we do think we have a lot to leverage, and that we don't need direct confrontation with Iran to be able to contain this problem, which can be managed. And in terms of current policy and where to go, we understand there's the need for the near term focus, which is absolutely right. The administration is right. You do need to deal, and President Biden has said this himself, you need to put a lid back on the Iranian nuclear program. It's not the only challenge, certainly. But if you don't contain that challenge, all the other challenges become much more difficult. So we do argue for a return to the JCPOA through multilateral diplomacy. That's the optimal way forward. That's facing challenges at the moment, but it's still the best option. But we also supplement that with a longer term approach. A lot of what this report is about is thinking longer term, thinking bigger picture. And here we take the longer view that we need to think about how we deflate Iran's influence over time. And here we take a play from kind of the way we did things in the Cold War, where, yes, we had military deterrence, but part of Kennan's containment was also about how you mellow Soviet activism over time and undermine the areas that the Soviets could capitalize on. So we look at this and we say, let's look at the neighborhood. Let's think about whether we can help create a better alternative. Let's focus on people in the region. Let's focus on accountability. Let's focus on governance. This would reduce the drivers that lead to the turmoil and instability that Iran is able to capitalize on. So that's just, a few of the kind of key takeaways of what we're suggesting here in terms of our longer term approach.
Today is March 1st. Do you think we're going to see a return to the JCPOA anytime soon? Is that still on the table? And is a window closing as we get closer to a presidential election season in Iran? They have elections in June.
I am increasingly worried. I am still as someone who does believe that the nuclear agreement is the best option for containing this problem. It's not a perfect solution, but it's the best solution for now, and then we can build on it. So I think it's the right approach. I'm increasingly worried because I think there is a problem of mindset on both sides, believing that each may have more leverage than they actually do. Of course, you have domestic politics on both sides that make this incredibly tricky. The Iranians have not been making it easy for the Biden administration to give concessions, but there was, maybe they were unrealistic expectations, but there were high expectations. Biden himself on numerous occasions reiterated the U.S. would like to return to compliance with this agreement. The United States is out of compliance since President Trump left the agreement in 2018. So the big question today is kind of who goes first? How do you get back to a compliance agreement? And then after that is reinstated, you can move forward on other issues. Until you get that back, you're not going anywhere. So I think we do have a time issue. It's not just related to the Iranian elections in June. It's related to the fact that right now there is growing mistrust and frustration. I think the Iranians are looking at the Biden team and they are starting to wonder. Of course, this is, they're quite drastically different in policy orientation already. But there is this perception in Tehran that they're not clear that if they give concessions and go back to the nuclear deal, that's going to be enough. And so I think we are in a very delicate moment. My hope is that we do get back to the table quickly, because the more we have this public posturing and the more we have this delay, I think the more difficult it's going to be. Time is not on the side of restoring the JCPOA.
Linda, there is a section in the report on Iraq as a pivotal player. I can't think of anyone who knows Iraq and the security situation there as well as you do. You spent so much time there dealing with all the players and both in the coalition, American side, the Iraqi side. How do we deal with these challenges in Iraq, the pro-Iran militias, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Iran? Tell us about what the report says about Iraq, as Iraq seems to gain in your assessment as a key regional partner.
Yes, well, it's a key focal point for sure. And thank you for asking how we approach Iraq in this report. And then we can address what the latest Biden administration actions have been, the first military action they've undertaken. But the way we look at Iraq is a pivotal player for a number of reasons. Iran, of course, next door, Iraq has been a venue for increasing Iranian influence, and Iran will undoubtedly have substantial ties with its neighbor no matter what. But the concern has been creeping influence and domination in a way that compromises Iraqi sovereignty. Number two, and where the U.S. focus has been so heavily in the last decade and more, is the cradle, really, of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And really, I view Iraq as the birthplace. It grew out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was the venue for much of the action in the recent years to dislodge ISIS from its physical caliphate straddling Iraq and Syria, massive swaths of territory. And the aftermath of that is very important because, as you well know, when the shooting stops, it doesn't necessarily mean the fight is over. There's still 1 million Iraqis displaced within Iraq, living in very parlous conditions. There are a large number of Iraqis detained in Syria and in camps in Syria. There's been really a languishing effort to rebuild key areas like Mosul of all major city in Iraq. But more broadly than that, there's a question about Iraq as a major, fifth largest oil reserves in the world, a major player in the region, and thus a key factor in stability or instability. And that brings us to this issue of its kind of arrested development, if you will. It's been struggling despite its resources to provide basic services to its population. It was the venue of one of the Arab Spring II popular protests, really swept up much of the country in protests that was really only tamped down, A, by COVID, but B, by some unfortunate, very bloody repression of those protests. The country at bottom needs serious economic and political reform. And if it isn't able to do that in the near future, it's going to have extremely bad effects for not just the country, but the region. So we see a need, as Dalia was saying, to move away from a narrow threatism focus, but it means using a different approach to Iraq that recognizes all of these intersecting U.S. interests, continue with the global coalition to defeat ISIS, but focus really away from the military aspects to the things that are really going to prevent the resurgence of ISIS. And that includes things like the counter-propaganda effort, because most of these, the U.S. intel community has assessed that it's really the inspired attacks through social media that represents the main threat to us. There's a cooperative counter-threat finance effort that has been built up over years, and also a very robust law enforcement and border control cooperation. And these are all things that need to continue. And then we have a dwindling number of troops there. They're now about 2,500, and the Biden administration will decide what force level it deems is necessary. And of course, the Iraqis were there by the Iraqis' invitation. They will determine what they would like. But I think it's very important to get that right. Too little, and you're not going to be able to accomplish those long-term security cooperation missions. And while we've expended a huge amount of blood and treasure there, lots of treasure trying to build Iraqi security forces. There's really a mixed bag there. Some have been very effective, some less so. And we need to, I think, find that Goldilocks right balance there.
Linda, one of the outcomes of the protest, Prime Minister Adel Abdulmati resigned after the security forces, as you mentioned, had killed and cracked down on protesters. And one of the outcomes was Mustafa al-Kadhimi becoming prime minister. He's working with President Barham Saleh, and they're trying to implement a reform program. They're trying to bridge that gap between good governance and the demands of Iraq's youth cohort who want jobs and want a better future. The economic situation is so difficult. How can the U.S. and the international community help Iraq and help the leadership there strengthen their commitment and path to economic reform so that some of the demands and needs of those protesters begin to be met?
Thank you. Yes, and I recognize Mustafa al-Kadhimi is well known to you and a former Al-Monitor writer. We have to see how difficult Iraq's recent situation has been. The oil price drops in the pandemic caused the GDP to shrink by 10%. And then there are the fundamental issues there. I was so struck when the Iraqi Minister of Finance came to Washington last summer and publicly pleaded with the U.S. to help lobby for conditionality in the IMF lending they were looking for to really bolster their efforts to reform the system. And this is the real, despite the Prime Minister's and the President Barham's efforts and support for reform, the parliamentary system is extremely difficult to work with. There'll be elections. I think they're now planned for October, finally, of this year. And it's a matter of building that coalition within that parliamentary system. And I think the U.S. can play a pivotal role, making clear that it is supportive of these measures. And really, what our major theme of this report is pivoting away from military focus solutions, the labor unemployment, the youth unemployment rates, the highest public sector employment, unfavorable climates for private sector entrepreneurship. These are fundamental things that are going to make the difference between the region and Iraq, in particular, moving ahead or not. And so whereas the previous administration had really undertaken a number of kind of punitive measures against Iraq and drawn down its embassy personnel. I think that there's a case to be made that some significant support to this very constructive government that's currently in power to shore it up against some of the Iranian actions against it in violation of its sovereignty, and also against some of the spoiling actors within the parliament might just make the difference there. But at the end of the day, let's be clear. I mean, Iraq has to be the one to take the hard steps, and it does have some very tough decisions it's got to make to bring its budget into balance, to provide electricity for people. This is one of these, ongoing, just it's really unconscionable that a country of this wealth and education cannot provide basic electricity and water for its population.
The report has a section on U.S. policy toward Russia and China, or how it needs to calibrate its Middle East policy, taking into account Russia and China as adversaries. But you also talk about areas of cooperation between these two powers. For any of you who wants to take this one, explain what the U.S. objectives should be in the region as we pursue the interests, if you've been describing them, with regard to our main adversaries globally, Russia and China.
Yeah, and we do tackle the issue. I don't think you can have a strategy report on any region of the world today without taking on the question, particularly about China. But we deal with both global competitors, Russia and China. And what we assess here, and there's also, I want to recommend other terrific RAND work in this area, very good studies, which suggest out of the two global competitors, China is by far and beyond the more long-term and more serious strategic competitor by almost any measure. But in the Middle East, Russia still is a significant concern. Still playing in the region in some zero-sum ways, wanting to keep the status quo, keep the US down, is the perception at least. And so especially its activity in Syria was, I think, a very good example of that. China is much more focused on its economic interest, on the Belt and Road Initiative, and using the Middle East from that perspective. Although some of its economic and infrastructure development are quite worrying, especially when it comes to the buildup of cities and surveillance technologies and technology transfer in general. Those are all things that we're quite worried about. But the way we look at it is that we do acknowledge and outline many of these growing roles for both Russia and China in the Middle East, as different as they are. And that this is a concern, but we also highlight some of the limits both of these countries face. They have to straddle themselves relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. China is still quite vulnerable. It imports 40% of its oil from the region. And we also argue that the U.S. still maintains some advantages, that, U.S. products, U.S. Military goods are still sought after or still preferred, and that we can use that leverage. But I think the biggest takeaway in our assessment is that we don't think that this region, where we know there's going to be competition, but just like with the threatism mindset of whether it was the Soviet Union, Arab nationalists, now Iran, we don't need to get into that mindset of every problem in the Middle East needs to be looked at through the prism of great power competition. We argue against moving to a Cold War-like competition with Russia and China in the Middle East. And as you mentioned, we think there may even be productive areas where we can cooperate. There are areas where we cannot, and where their activity does infringe on our interests. But for example, on questions like non-proliferation, nobody in the region, including Russia and China, wants a nuclear-armed Iran. They are parties to the JCPOA, and that is an area we can usefully cooperate. China does not have an interest in regional instability and continued conflict. To get its oil out of this region, it needs things to stay calm. So I think, we can be looking for some of those areas of common interest, but it will be harder to do that if we just reduce the region to this notion that everything is about how we can confront and diminish Chinese and Russian power.
Let me ask just a quick follow-up on that. Does your report, or to what degree does your report assess that if the U.S. steps back, that Russia and China could step in and increase their influence in a meaningful way? For example, in Egypt purchases arms from Russia. In the Gulf, we see an increased interest in the Chinese model of business and development, and you talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. And in Turkey, probably most in the news, the purchase of the S-400 missile defense system and what's that done or contributed to the difficulties in U.S.-Turkish relations. How concerned are we about that, or are those in your score manageable concerns?
Yeah, it's a great question. Everything in this region is about trade-offs. Just like we are arguing for diversifying our partnerships, as Jeff outlined, we know that our regional partners have been, this isn't a new thing, they've been diversifying their partnerships for some time. And that's always the risk, is that this will, that if we don't sell it, that's often the argument against these massive, the arguments, including those that we make in the report, that this massive transfer of arms sales to Arab Gulf states in particular are not conducive to regional stability. The argument is, but if we don't sell them, someone else will. And we've been hearing that for so many years. So that is a trade-off, because we already see these states closer for a variety of reasons, but especially because of the oil interest when it comes to China. China is still the most dependent on the region. And as Jeff mentioned, we are now no longer dependent on this region for import. We're actually now an oil exporting state. So, that's always a risk. Our feeling is that can be managed. that we still, that we also need to be thinking about taking leadership roles, because if the goal is to reduce regional instability and conflict, we need to be saying, how can we not just compete for who can send more and more arms to this region, but how can we start thinking about a different paradigm and moving away from this? So some of the things we allude to in the report, for example, is thinking back to when President Bush in the early 90s, after the first Gulf War, called for a moratorium on arms sales. We need to start getting creative and stop getting back into the same cycles of the past. And so we acknowledge that that's always a risk, but the cost of doing business as we are now have been enormous, and that we need to have a different cost benefit calculus. Jeff may want to weigh in here in terms of the specific partnerships with Egypt, I think you asked about.
Jeff, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Andrew. I could jump in for just a minute and say, I think Dalia hit the right points, which are, regardless of how the United States engages, some partners are diversifying. I think, Andrew, you alluded to the Su-35, the advanced fighter aircraft that Egypt is purchasing from Russia. The Arab Gulf partners had previously been interested in getting lethal drones from China. And so some of that, I think, is inevitable regardless of what the United States does. The real risk, though, is that every new announcement from the Belt and Road Initiative, every new announcement by China of some investment in a port leads the United States to double down on business as usual. And that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid Russia or China being able to basically keep the United States with these legacy-based partnerships by simply making a new announcement that they're made slight inroads here or made slight inroads there. We need to revisit whether these relationships are advancing US interests. And just because China announces that it's going to buy some commercial port access here shouldn't keep the United States from revisiting whether the relationships as they're currently constructed really advance Washington's interests.
So Linda, last question. You talk about recalibrating policy tools in the study, and you talk about diplomacy, economic aid, force posture, how to emphasize non-military over military, or to give greater priority to non-military means. How can the U.S., in undertaking that shift, address the demands of the youth, the protesters, to achieve a better life, to demand and get good governance from their countries, to have jobs and better education? What can the U.S. be doing in this recalibration of tools to reach out to that cohort that we haven't done so far?
This is just, I think, so important as the crux of our report, and it shouldn't be interpreted that we're pivoting away from the region or trying to exact punitive measures. If you have a situation where 80% of your aid is going to military focused programs, that on its face is just unbalanced. And what you gain by shifting that balance is really addressing these major fundamental conditions in the region, which is what the people of the region need and want. And the youth, I believe, we're at this very significant point. It's 10 years after the Arab Spring. There are more activists in jail than at any time since those uprisings. The people in Iraq and Lebanon have come out in force. There are people that really, I think the youth of the region are not going to indefinitely tolerate the conditions they're living in. 60% of the population is under the age of 25. Highest youth unemployment in the world. Women and girls face more gender exclusion than anywhere else. There's a just severe mismatch between skills and jobs in the job market. And I think that the issue about statism, the model or the bargain that the governments of the region have for long struck. If we will provide you jobs in exchange for quiescence, that's really broken down likely permanently as oil revenues decline and the traditional model doesn't work. So what US programming can do is help with those fundamental economic reforms that need to occur. And it's not just about aid. Things like trade and investment treaties, people-to-people programs, education, and we do have to, I think, elevate the humanitarian aid component because the region and the world has never seen this severe and refugee and displacement crisis. And the people suffering is just, it's front and center for people who follow I'll monitor, but I think there has been an obscuring of just how much human suffering there is. One thing I want to point out on the positive side, lest people fear that aid is going to poor results. U.S. Congress has actually been systematically increasing its requests that programs undergo rigorous assessment, monitoring, and evaluation. And that has been happening, but it needs to be rigorously enforced. And then once those assessments are available, they need to be used to make decisions about further flows of aid. The other thing that's happened, Congress last year passed the Global Fragility Act. And this is really a second of two parts of a new model for the U.S. to dispense assistance and particularly stabilization assistance. And it requires a more focused and coordinated approach that avoids the overspending and waste of the previous years. I think that stabilization got a very bad name with the overspending in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And in fact, much of that went to fuel corruption. So there's a very strong set of recommendations in the report about how to improve the delivery of those programs and to really coordinate with our multilateral and bilateral partners so that what other countries are doing, we have a combined effect together.
Well said. Thank you for raising that. It's a very, very important part of your study. And let me just conclude by saying, Dalia, Linda, Jeff, this has been great. Your RAND power trio, as it were, and the report lives up to the billing. It's a must read. Thank you for joining us today and discussing it with us on the Middle East.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Pleasure to be with you.
Thanks, Andrew. We appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks again, Andrew.
We will return after this short break.
I'm Ben Caspit. I'll monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I'm glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts, and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel. I'll monitor.
That was a fantastic conversation with Dalia, Linda, and Jeff. They have given us a lot to think about, including the importance of challenging long-held assumptions, employing metrics and methodologies to better understand the value of partnerships and outcomes, and how the tools of diplomacy can be used to reach and engage that next generation of Arab youth who are seeking a better future and a new social contract with the governing classes in the region. Thanks to our production team of Phil Calabro of El Monitor and Beowulf Rochland of Two Square Media Productions. And thanks to all of you for listening today. We will return next week. And in the meantime, please sign up for this and our other Al Monitor podcast on Israel at your favorite podcast platform.